Well, there was two different tones in the comments he made. So the first was some of what we just heard, so in reference to describing the armed groups there as a festering abscess, criminals who use civilians as human shields, and that they must be liquidated. Very strong words, and yet at the same time, he was also saying that there was a political understanding between Moscow and Ankara, and that it should be separated, that they should separate those terrorist groups from the normal armed opposition groups. And so you've got one tone which is quite sharp and aggressive, and the other tone that implies some sort of diplomacy. And the question is, how do we interpret that? Well, one thing to look at is, of course, who was being referred to specifically, because no names were dropped there in the comments. And one group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is considered a terrorist group by the United States, by the EU, by Turkey, and it is pretty much the strongest group within Idlib. And yet there are other armed groups, opposition groups, that have now coalesced into a sort of coalition who also are there. And yet you've got to remember that the regime and their Russian backers have, since the start of the conflict in Syria, referred to any armed group that chooses to oppose them as terrorists. So different terminology being used there by Sergey Lavrov, and now we'll see how the diplomacy now goes forward. Next week we're expecting in Iran the Iranians, the Turks and the Russians to get together and to discuss how Idlib, the operation, if it's going to happen, how it's going to go ahead, and from the Turkish side at least, to try and stop the regime and the Russian side from advancing on Idlib.
And Abubakr, what humanitarian cost would an advance on Idlib have?
Well, you talked about the UN there. The UN were referring to 800,000 people possibly fleeing. Before they were talking about 700,000. I think the main point they're trying to put across there is that it's going to be a big number. This is going to be a lot of people who are going to be effective if a military offensive by the regime does start on Idlib. You've got to remember that Idlib is home to around 3 million people, many of whom are actually internally displaced from other areas in Syria, because Idlib has been the area where, when opposition groups have been defeated in other areas of Syria, they've then gone to Idlib to kind of seek a sort of refuge there, despite, of course, the attacks that have occurred. And many of those people are relying on aid that comes from across the border from Turkey, and as well as aid workers to provide food, to provide shelter. So the very real fear is that should a conflict start, that will impact on the ability of aid groups to bring in that aid that really is so necessary to the average civilian in Idlib, and therefore the humanitarian cost of any operation would be incredibly great.